Hello again, friends. Today I wanted to cover the rest of the diatonic seventh chords. We can talk a little bit about each one, what it does, any interesting things to deal with as far as voice leading is concerned, and some of the musical examples from the textbook. We begin with 4-7, the subdominant chord. And the subdominant chord has a couple of interesting tidbits that we have to deal with. So let's begin first by creating one. To simplify things, we'll stick around in the key of C major. In the key of C major, the 4 chord would be rooted on F. We would have F with a stack of thirds above it. Now adding a 7th to that stack, because we're talking about 7th chords. The quality of this 7th chord, we have a major triad, and on the outside is a major 7th chord. So this is what we call a major 7th. Sounds like this. This particular sonority is a little bit unusual in tonal music, although we hear it all the time in jazz and popular music. So if I score this chord, we're in the key of C, it's a 4 chord. If I score this chord in 4 voices, something like this. There's a couple of things that can happen with this chord. With each of these diatonic sevenths, one thing to keep in mind is that the 7th is always going to resolve downward. We've talked about that already with 5-7, with 2-7, with 7-7. That's a consistent pattern that the 7th of the chord resolves downward. And this chord is no exception. The 7th of the chord, right here, this E, is going to resolve downward by step to a D. So, the chord of resolution, by default, is required to have a D in it. That limits the possibilities for where a 4 chord can resolve. Now, we know that a 4 is a subdominant. Is the subdominant, sorry, it's a predominant chord. We're talking our tonal template. And so because it's a predominant, we expect it to move to the dominant. Thankfully, in the key of C major, the dominant chord is going to have G, B, and D. D is the pitch we're looking for, so that works out nicely. If we're going to a dominant chord, let's just see what happens here. We're going to move the root upward. The 7th of the chord resolved downward, so we've dealt with our tendency tone. And now we simply move to the next closest chord member in each case. This C in the tenor can slide down to a B natural, and this A can move to a G. So we have parallel fourths here in the soprano and alto. That's totally fine. It's totally fine. This resolution doesn't really cause any problems. Now, if these two voices were flipped, if the 7th of the chord, the E, was above the A, then we would run into problems because we would have some parallels. One of the ways that we could deal with those parallels would be by using a cadential 6/4. So let's go ahead and we're going to go ahead and write this so that we have this parallel problem. So here's our 4-7. Our 4-7 is going to move to 5. This E, because it's the 7th of the chord, should move downward by step to the D. If it does that, then we run into problems with the alto. The reason the alto needs to step from A down to G is because if we move from A up to B natural, we have 2 thirds in this dominant chord, and the third of the dominant chord is the leading tone. We don't want to double the leading tone because it's going to have somewhere in particular it needs to resolve. Okay? So, one of the things that composers did, instead of resolving immediately, they chose, should have stems on these, they chose a cadential 6/4 to 5/3. Thus alleviating the parallel problems up here because this fifth doesn't move to this fifth at the same time. That sounds like this. That's a pretty straightforward solution. The other option is, as I pointed out at the beginning, having these two voices in opposite scoring, so that the seventh of the chord is underneath the third of the chord, and thus they can both resolve downward as expected in parallel fourths instead of parallel fifths. Now the other interesting thing that can happen with a 4 chord, and this one I really like. Let's go ahead and keep the voicing as you see here. Now we talked about this briefly in one of the previous videos. Within the predominant realm, we can move from one chord to another. So a predominant chord doesn't need to go immediately to a dominant. A predominant chord can go from one predominant chord to another before moving to the dominant. So for example, if I'm on a 6 chord, that 6 chord could move to 4 before going to 5. Or in this case, 4, as you might guess, given the fact that the 7th needs to resolve downward by step to D, this chord has to have a D. One of the chords in C major that has a D is 2. It's a D chord. It's a D minor chord in the key of C major. And so 4 can move to 2. 4/7 goes to 2 before resolving on to 5. And the great thing about this is that the resolution, in some cases, and this is the way that composers often did this, the resolution only requires one voice to move. Because between 4/7 and 2/7, in this case in inversion, D, F, A, and C, this would be a 2 in 6/5 position. 3 pitches are held in common. So we can move seamlessly from a 4/7 to a 2/7 in inversion before moving to a tonic. Sorry, before moving to a dominant. There's the tonic. So, in summary, and this wouldn't have to be a 2/7 by the way, this C could move up to D here. That would be totally fine. Then we wouldn't have a 7th in our 2 chord. That works the same way. So 4/7 will sometimes go to 5, but there are potential parallel issues that you have to take care of. Or 4 will, probably more often than going to 5, 4 will go to 2, like we just saw. Now I forgot to point out one thing about 4/7 going to 5, and this may be of interest to you. Because it's one of those times when composers would sometimes break the rules. If we're moving from 4/7 to 5/7, instead of just vanilla 5, we still move root to root in the bass. This C in the tenor needs to go to the B natural so that we have a third, which is the leading tone. The A is going to move down to G. That's the closest chord member that doesn't double the leading tone. And now, this seventh of the 4/7, instead of resolving downward by step like we generally expect sevenths to do, it actually resolves upward to the seventh of the dominant chord. This is unusual. We see composers doing this sometimes, but it's unusual because what we have now are parallel sevenths. We're not breaking any rules by doing parallel sevenths, but it's a little unusual to have two voices sharing parallel sevenths. There are other options to deal with here, but this one was worth pointing out because we do find it sometimes in the literature. Here's how that sounds. And back to tonic. Now, I would encourage you to, at this moment, go ahead and pause the video and go listen to the Mozart Piano Sonata excerpt. This is a really interesting one because you will hear all sorts of seventh chords in sequence, but ultimately each of the seventh chords does what we expect. The seventh resolves down, the leading tones are taken care of as needed, sort of. Go take a listen. So what you saw with the 4/7 was an example in the minor mode, 4/7 going to 7/7. In this case, it doesn't follow our tonal harmonic template because sequences are not harmonic. Sequences are melodic entities. And so the thing that's driving this is the melodic motion in the three voices. The soprano voice starting on D flat and going down to C, and then down to B flat, then down to A flat. Concurrently, the alto voice, the second voice, goes A flat to G to F to E, and so on. So that's an interesting example to listen to. The Bach chorale here on page 233, if you're following along in your text, this is just, again, another example of a subdominant seventh chord in action. This one is unusual in that it comes from the minor mode, but includes raised scale degree 6, which we get from the melodic minor scale. And because of that, the quality of this chord is major minor, the same as our dominant seventh chords. But it doesn't function as a major minor chord. It's a 4 chord, so we expect it to move as a predominant into a dominant. It moves from 4 to 5. The voice leading there works basically as expected. A 4 in 6/5 position resolves to a 5, also in first inversion. The seventh in that case is a G. The seventh of the 4 chord is that G, and it does resolve down by step. Bach avoids the parallels by taking the tenors leaping from E to B. So there's your subdominant seventh chord. Head on to the next video and we will talk about 6/7. The rest of them are going to be much shorter because they're going to do a lot of the same things that we just saw with the subdominant seventh chord.